Hello, and welcome to the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. You're standing in the lobby of Manhattan's oldest farmhouse, first built in 1784 and donated to New York City as a museum in 1916. Though the Dyckman Farmhouse functions today as a historic house museum, our mission is to be a place of community for the Inwood neighborhood we call home, and to represent all the people we serve in our programming. Before you begin your self-guided tour today, we'll be taking you through a brief history of the farmhouse from the distant past to our present day, and hope you'll join us to learn more about our place as a living piece of Inwood's history.
Hi, I'm Don Rice. I'm the board president of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum Alliance. Today we're going to talk about the story of the Dyckman Farmhouse, how it was built, how it became a museum, how it passed through the decades of time, and even a little bit about before the farmhouse was built. Jan Dykeman was the first Dykeman to arrive in America, and he came from Bentheim in Westphalia, which is now part of Germany, but is near the Holland border. So we think he arrived in New Harlem, or Manhattan, in around the 1660s. After living in New Harlem a while, Jan Dykeman and his friend Jan Nagel were granted large chunks of North Manhattan land in 1677. During the 1600s, the Dykeman and the Nagel family intermarried, and by 1690 or so, when they moved to Inwood, they were one big blended family. Once Jan Dykeman had moved to Inwood, it was mostly a matter of getting the farm going. So much of the 1700s was spent in agricultural pursuits. The neighborhood was relatively sleepy. I think the only action going on in the neighborhood was the construction of the King's Bridge. By summer of 1776, it was clear that Upper Manhattan was going to be a battleground in the Revolutionary War. In the summer of 1776, William Dykeman, who was the third generation of Dykemans, started to abandon the neighborhood in sort of anticipation of the Revolutionary War. So William moved a large extended family, multi-generational, north. We don't know exactly where they stayed, but we do know that Dykemans were scattered throughout Westchester. So with the Dykemans gone, they weren't even here for the Battle of Fort Washington, but their farm was the battleground. And then for the next 7 years, British and Hessian forces occupied the Dyckman farm. William Dykeman had sons, however, who did fight during the Revolution. His oldest son was Jacobus Dykeman, who later lived in the farmhouse that still exists. Jacobus's two younger brothers, Bram and Mike, were pretty active in rebel forces in the neighborhood. They both served as guides. At some point during this war and occupation, the Dyckman farmstead itself, the homes, were burned. Eventually, the war came to an end, and the British evacuated in November of 1783. The Dykemans returned probably early in 1784 and found their neighborhood destroyed, and their home destroyed, and their farm destroyed. So they rebuilt. The Dykemans' new house was built at the 13th mile marker on the new road, which is now Broadway that we know. The farmhouse came together relatively quickly in stages. Remember, there was no Home Depot or anything, so the first farmhouse would have been thrown together kind of quickly, and it wouldn't really have looked like the one that we have today. Maybe within the next 10 years, the summer kitchen would have been added, and then later in the 1830s, an addition on the north of the farmhouse was added. And in between that time, maybe around 1815 or so, the porches would have been added and the interior finished, better stairs instead of ladders, things like that. In addition to building the farmhouse itself, of course, outbuildings would have been part of that construction process. We're thinking barns, we're thinking stables, we're thinking smokehouses, we're thinking cider presses and wells, outhouses, things like that. This is such a big job to rebuild a farm and to build a house that we have to assume that it was built in a large part by labor of enslaved people. We don't know a lot about the enslaved people who lived on the Dyckman farm, but we know a few things. We know that Jacob Dyckman Jr. enslaved at least one person, and that person self-liberated in 1765. His name was Will, or Wilthier. We know that Jacobus Dykeman, in 1809, manumitted an enslaved man on the Dyckman farm named Francis Cujo. But following up on later census records, Francis Cujo seems to have moved downtown and is listed as a gardener in the 1820 census. We know that there was a free black woman on the Dyckman farm, a cook named Hannah. Her mother had been enslaved on the Dyckman farm. So when William Dyckman died in 1787, the house was actually put up for sale, and so was the farm. But by 1793, Jacobus Dyckman seems to have moved back from Westchester, moved down into this farmhouse and taken over the farm. Jacobus and his wife, Hannah Brown Dyckman, or rather his wife, Hannah Brown Dyckman, had 11 children. 2 of the children went to college, James and Jacob. One became a lawyer, one became a doctor. They both died young. After Jacobus's death, Isaac and Michael, his 2 sons, took over the family farm. Neither Isaac nor Michael were ever married. There were no children of theirs to take over the next generation of the farm. One of their nephews, a kid named James Frederick Smith, was invited to live here at the farmhouse and sort of absorb how to do real estate and absorb how to do farming and sort of learn the family business. The 2 brothers had an eye on him as perhaps the person of the next generation to take over. So they moved out of the farmhouse around 1850 to a home in Marble Hill. They lived there in that house until they died, both brothers. And then James Frederick Smith took over. But there was a catch. In the wills of Isaac and Michael Dyckman, James Frederick Smith became heir to all of the Dyckman property if he would legally change his name to Isaac Michael Dyckman, which he did. And this was in the mid-1860s when this happened. And one of the things that was all planned out in advance, one of the things that he was going to do was sell off the land. From 1868 to 1871, there were 4 land auctions during which almost all of the Dyckman land was sold. And in the final auction of 1871, the Dyckman farmhouse was sold. So along with the lowering of Broadway and the improvement of 204th Street, a lot of other streets were being pushed through the neighborhood, built up through the neighborhood, graded down through the neighborhood, and with all this earth moving, amateur archaeologists were starting to discover or rediscover aspects of the neighborhood's past. 2 of these guys, Reginald Pelham Bolton and William Calver, and 3 or 4 or 5 other people would regularly dig up here every Sunday. These guys were interested in the story of what was in the neighborhood before. They were interested in the Dyckmans and the Nagels and other families. They were interested in the Lenape. They were interested in the Revolutionary War. As our farmland is being destroyed, it's allowing people to learn about the past.
So if you look on some historic maps, you would notice that there's an area on what is now present day about 212th Street between Broadway and 10th Avenue that is listed as the Inwood slave burial ground. So this was near the Dyckmans' first home that they built in this area, and it was where the Dyckmans and the Nagels, another Dutch family in this area, buried the people that they enslaved. And so that enslaved cemetery was sort of left and forgotten about when, as New York City starts to move northward, the family burial grounds were dug up and reinterred in the Bronx, and the slave burial ground was just left to be kind of surrounded by urban growth. And so it wasn't until 1903 that that burial ground was sort of rediscovered. And they did find bones that were sort of left and not treated well and properly at all. And today, we as an organization feel that it's really important for us to bring awareness about this burial ground and do whatever we can to make it more well known and for this to be a topic that we discuss.
In 1915, the farmhouse was purchased by the 2 Dyckman sisters, Mary Alice Dyckman Dean and Fanny Frederica Dyckman Welch. They were the daughters of Isaac Michael Dyckman. They rebought the farmhouse with an eye towards restoration, not moving the farmhouse, but keeping the farmhouse on the site it was originally built on. Their 2 husbands were ideally suited for the job that the sisters had in mind. Mary Alice Dyckman Dean was married to Bashford Dean, who's a museum curator at the Museum of Natural History and at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And Fanny Frederica Dyckman Welch was married to Alexander Macmillan Welch, an architect. It only took about a year to renovate this farmhouse with the idea towards giving it to the city. And on July 11th, 1916, the new museum was dedicated by the city. And so for the last 100+ years, the Dyckman Farmhouse, built in 1784, has been a museum. In 1967, it became a New York City landmark and also a National Historic Landmark. The city has grown up around it, so this farmhouse, which used to be alone here on this stretch of Kingsbridge Road, is now surrounded by the city.
So now that you've learned a bit about the museum's place in Inwood's past, we'll give you a look at our role in Inwood today. Between our educational initiatives and community-focused programming, the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum strives to make our mission accessible to all of our Upper Manhattan community. The Dyckman Discovered Initiative was a project the museum began in 2018 with the goal of investigating the history of slavery at the Dyckman Farmhouse. Before this project, not much was known about the enslaved people who lived and worked on the Dyckman farm. We wanted to address this gap in our knowledge head-on and present a more transparent and inclusive narrative about the history of enslavement at our site.
We were the recipient of a grant from the New York Community Trust, which allowed us to hire a research assistant to really start to do some deep diving into historic documents to find as much information as we could about the people who were enslaved and free who lived on this property. And through the research, we found several names. We actually have 2 first and last names, which is pretty rare. So we really want to be able to highlight their names and talk about Francis Cujo and talk about Hannah and make that a focal point of what we do here at the museum. One of the things that kind of came out of that research project that I told you that we were talking about outside Dyckman Discovered was the art installation that's in the museum right now, which is called Unspoken Voices, Honoring the Legacy of Black America. And we're looking at Rachel Sadlowski's kind of transformation of the parlor.
This is beautiful.
Rachel created these amazing candles that when you point them at different artifacts and art pieces in the room, that actually illuminates the name of an enslaved person that we found through our research.
Keeping with the mission of our Dyckman Discovered initiative, the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum holds free educational programming about the history of slavery and racial injustice in our country. Our primary discussion panel series, Talking About Race Matters and Dyckman Discussions, are guided by the hard work and insight of many historians and community leaders.
All of these individuals deserve more than a passing notice. They deserve to be considered on their own terms, and that became work for me to try to figure out okay, cool, they deserve to be considered on their own terms. How is the next question.
Another one of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum's initiatives is a public program we call Growing Uptown. In partnership with Garden Kitchen Lab and New York Common Pantry, we developed a free workshop that teaches Upper Manhattan residents how to grow their own food, providing them with grow kits and accessible recipes and remedies they can create from the comfort of their homes.
When COVID-19 hit, and we also how the food distribution channels were broken, and we saw people that we knew affected by it and feeling the food insecurity of not knowing if they were going to have food the day after, it really touched all of us. It hit me, and something had to be done about this.
From lectures about local Inwood history to free educational craft workshops for kids, to celebrations like the Immigrant History Festival and Pinkster with Okra Dance Co., our goal is to provide a hands-on, accessible educational experience that celebrates the diverse culture and history of our local community. The Dyckman Farmhouse Museum also regularly features local artists and musicians in our programming. Past exhibitions have been inspired by the history of the house and the vibrant community the museum calls home. We Are, Inwood is an ever-changing exhibit that invites community members to submit their artwork and contributions for display, celebrating the many unique people who make Inwood a wonderful place to call home. Thank you for choosing to support the Dyckman Farmhouse. We hope you enjoy your visit today and that you'll come back and join us for some of our upcoming programming.